What happens when an ancient site gets discovered that breaks not only archaeological models for that time period, but academic ideas about the entirety of human history? Well, just that happened when in the late 90s, Gobekli Tepe was excavated by Klaus Schmidt in Turkey. The site had previously been thought to have been medieval. However, after being excavated, was carbon dated to 9500 BC, which if you don't know is pre-agriculture, pre-writing, pre-ceramics, and all round far enough back in time that it's really beyond human comprehension. What's even wilder is that due to the site's age, we think it was built by hunter-gatherers, which, as you might expect, shattered our conceptions of not only what was possible that far back in antiquity, but also our understandings of things like the development of religion, adaptations of agriculture, the nature of hunter-gatherer groups, and the overall timeline of human society. It's just ridiculous. Despite all this, nobody really knows how the site was actually used. Like, what actually did it do? So today we're going to have a look at some of the most popular theories and tangents around Gobekli Tepe, which will get more and more obscure as we go down this iceberg. The site, for our purposes, is divided into two levels or time periods, level 2 and 3. Don't ask me why it's not 1 and 2. Archaeologists are goofy people. Level 3 contains these massive circular stone enclosures that we all know and love, and it is infamously dated to 9500 BC. Level 2 doesn't actually contain any of these structures, but will be super relevant to a lot of the theories we're going to be looking at. It instead contains a buttload of smaller rectangular structures built around the enclosures, and it is dated to, at earliest, around 9000 BC, which is still super old. These level 2 structures were used at the same time as the level 3 mega enclosures were being used, but their dating indicates that they were constructed sometime after them. Basically, if I reference the level 2 structures, just think the new block of apartments getting put in on a historic street, but the new apartments are over 5 times your chronological distance from Jesus. Only a tiny percentage of the overall site has actually been excavated, literally like 5 to 10%. So when you think about the site, imagine like 20 more of these megalithic structures and who knows how many more rectangular ones. The site is absolutely gigantic, and there are no real comparisons from anywhere near the time period. It is most commonly thought that the site had some kind of religious connotation and was a point of pilgrimage for multiple bands of hunter-gatherers who all came together to build the site in union. Last bit of background knowledge, and actually one of the biggest mysteries about the whole site, around 8000 BC, occupants of the site began filling up the level 3 structures with stones and bones, which is commonly referred to as the fill. Where they got this massive quantity of stuff from, nobody knows, and why they covered the enclosures, nobody knows. Also, as you've probably already noticed, I'm going to use a run on Hades as a lot of the backdrop for this video. Partly because I'm a lazybones, partly because I thought it would be cool, and mostly because this site isn't actually as well documented digitally as you might anticipate. A lot of the little bits and pieces we'll be discussing today don't actually have images outside of printed archaeological reports, which is super wacky, especially when it comes to some of the artifacts and associated sites. That said, leave any specific images you'd like to see in the comments and I'll try and point you in the right direction for references, or I'll try and have a bit of an extra dig myself. Pretty much everyone reckons the site was used for feasting. Most commonly, the feasting is linked to the actual building of the site, which obviously would have taken quite a bit of effort, and many archaeologists have hypothesized that the site was built by multiple hunter-gatherer groups, which would all gang up, build the site, and have a party, probably involving some kind of religious ceremony. The bone portion of the fill that was used to bury the level 3 structures was in large part animal bones, specifically the bones of Persian gazelle, which migrate during late summer. The conclusion being, gatherings at Gobekli Tepe probably coincided with those migrations. As well as this, the site plays host to the largest collection of stone tools in the pre-pottery Neolithic East, most of which were being used to process wild grain. These massive stone troughs are found in pretty much all of the level 2 structures, and by analysing the remains of grains, archaeologists have managed to work out that people would smash up the grain on top of the level 2 structures, and probably made whatever they wanted to make with these big troughs. There are some stone tools in the big level 3 enclosures, but way not as many as those in and around the level 2 ones. And additionally, analysis of the stone tools in the megalithic structures suggests that they were used for ochre, which has many religious connotations in Neolithic archaeology, and probably didn't taste that great. The fact that Gobekli Tepe has no storage silos as well strongly suggests that all this was being consumed at once, in feasting events. The nature of such feasting events remains mysterious. Even whether or not they were religious in nature is still debated. Did people live at the site? This is a harder question to answer than you might think. When the site was first excavated, Schmidt famously claimed that no domestic use for the site was tenable. He came to this conclusion primarily because the megastructures don't exactly say cozy dwelling. More academically, however, the site does lack easy access to water, any direct evidence for hearths or heating mechanisms, and as we just spoke about, it seems like all the food stuff was for event-focused feasting. More recently, this viewpoint is getting some pretty harsh pushback, and even before Schmidt did sadly pass away, he did concede that there was probably some amount of permanent residence, but to what degree is still heavily debated. Was it a big, permanent site? Or were there just a few people who looked after the site between feasts? Evidence for the site being domestic has mostly been crafted in big processual frameworks that aren't super fun or, in my opinion, even useful. But there is some contextual evidence. For instance, the presence of all that stuff that filled the megalithic enclosures. Lots of people think it was leftovers from stone quarries and feasting, but if the site did have permanent residents, they would have needed a trash pile, and a bunch of broken stone stuff and food scraps definitely fits the description. As well as this, the site does have some burnt plant remains here and there, just not super commonly. So we are seeing evidence for fire, but just exactly where is yet to be figured out, although hypotheses have been put forward, like in these big frame things found throughout the site, although they are more commonly thought of as doors. Even in the iconography, bits like these square things have been interpreted as houses. Considering all this, mostly people think it was just a few people looking after the site, maybe high-status religious folk. But this is not always the case. A historian named Banning, for instance, has argued that the site was actually a single sedentary community, and the level 3 mega enclosures were once houses for lots of people. He basically reckons the T-pillars would have held up timber beams for the roofs, and cites the lack of weathering inside the structures as evidence for this. And it's worth noting that during the excavations, Schmidt did actually note a lot of rapid weathering through rain, wind, and insects while the site was unprotected. So it definitely makes a lot of sense that in antiquity it would have been closed off. More commonly, however, people look to the level 2 rectangular structures as likely places for domestic residence. This is mostly due to the fact that by far the majority of the stone tools and general domestic equipments are based in or around these structures, whereas they are much rarer in the level 3 enclosures, which seem to contain a lot more religious stuff. Although, of course, the presence of religious stuff certainly does not disqualify a place as a domestic residency, especially this far back in the past. In the nearby site of Château-Hoyac, for instance, people buried their family in the house, and even in the level 2 rectangular structures, there is lots of religious iconography. For now, however, the most common view is that a small amount of people were based domestically around the level 2 structures and looked after the site between feasts, although honestly this whole topic is rarely analysed with any real specificity. That the site was in some way religious is not only the most popular interpretation, but I mean, even if you didn't know anything about the site and you just look at it, I think its religious vibe is pretty obvious, and the site is often referred to as the world's first temple. That said, the site is so unbelievably far back in time that we have to be a bit more careful with this thought, especially in trying to work out the ways in which the site actually religiously functioned. Think about this, for example. If you were part of a hunter-gatherer religion, it is very likely that a part of your spiritual belief will be somehow involved with animism, a religious trait that adds a spiritual vibe to your relationship with things in your environment. Think Studio Ghibli, river spirits and stuff like that. In fact, this study found 100% rates of animism in hunter-gatherers. So if your whole environment is holy and spiritual, why on earth would you need a temple? You just go out into nature and have an inherently spiritual experience. It's for reasons like this, whether or not the site was actually a temple is heavily debated. Some archaeologists actually take this one step further and think the site marks the beginnings of what we today call religion. Such a site probably required some kind of inherent social stratification or hierarchical society, which is something normally left out of academic ideas of hunter-gatherer society. Or in other words, part of the academic definition of a hunter-gatherer society is that they were mostly egalitarian. That Gobekli Tepe was out of step with this definition is suggested by the architectural planning, food distribution, and organisation of a workforce, especially so if the interpretation that the site was built by multiple bands of hunter-gatherers is found to be true. As well as this, past about 150 people, some archaeologists believe that human beings naturally begin placing themselves in hierarchies because 150 people is the maximum amount of people your brain can actually have a relationship with. So beyond that, you need some kind of organization to inform your relationship with unknowns. Going back to the temple, the idea is that the person who found themselves at the top of that hierarchical society then inserted themselves into a religious role in that context, which gave birth to the modern human-based stratified religion that we have today. The other end of this discussion is that maybe the site wasn't actually that spiritually important in the lives of its creators, which is very hard to comprehend nowadays because we put so much stock in monumental architecture. But it's important to keep this in your brain. After all the iconography here is of natural things and people, not of overtly abstract concepts as you might see today. This is a bit more of an ambiguous idea than anything else. It's the idea that the site was built by hunter-gatherers, which has some obvious game-changing takeaways that go much deeper than what we've already mentioned. One of the main questions here being, is this an ongoing practice of these hunter-gatherers, or something new they were developing? Currently, archaeologists have just added constructions like this to the corpus of things hunter-gatherers were learning to and could just do. However, as has been pointed out many times, the site's general architecture and raised relief definitely suggests some kind of developed practice. The ability to do these things certainly didn't happen overnight. Before Gobekli Tepe was excavated, sites like it were linked to things like grain surpluses caused by agriculture. You get someone who doesn't have to worry about food and suddenly they can just focus on making and developing cool art. These academic models, however, inherently don't make room for hunter-gatherer societies interacting with those kinds of activities, and Gobekli Tepe obviously makes a strong case for the contention that they did. Architectural analysis has suggested that the site was planned as a whole, not just slapstick, as in all of these structures were planned as a one-together thing. The feasting evidence demonstrates the ability to get pretty much as much food as you would like, and the art demonstrates an incredible level of stylistic advancement that isn't seen again for some time. The other side to this debate would be the contention that hunter-gatherers have known how to do this for thousands of years, and we can expect to find many of these types of sites throughout the world, perhaps as part of some ancient lost civilization. And this viewpoint is adapted by figures like Graham Hancock, who contend such a lost advanced civilization once existed. There's actually a debate on a JRE episode about this topic, which is pretty fun, and I will link it below, but I think both sides are kind of staring the answer in the face. When we talk about hunter-gatherer culture, we always say things like, oh my god, they were so advanced, but rarely do we actually step back and say, okay, well, how do we put this into our understanding of history? Here in Australia, people often go on about how advanced Aboriginal groups were, but then proceed to use their culture as anthropological evidence for the lowest level of civilization and technology. I don't think we need to embrace a lost civilization or just tack the site onto a list of feats that hunter-gatherers were capable of. We more probably need to put some respect on what those societies actually were. Anyways, I'm starting to get on a bit of a tangent, so I'll stop, but yes, the site was built by hunter-gatherers, and there are lots of theories as to what this implies. Because the site has been tied to social stratification, the site has also been seen as the place of the beginnings of agriculture through a thing called social theory. I actually have a whole video on the different ways people think agriculture came about that I highly recommend if this kind of thing interests you. But social theory is basically the idea that one of the top dogs in a society would have begun producing food in mass through agriculture to further establish their role in society, and feasting at the site certainly complements this hypothesis. As well as this, the site is from an area suggested to have had many of the first domesticated grains diffused out of it, and the Fertile Crescent has long been thought as the place agriculture first came about. Alternatively, historians who believe the site was occupied by a single sedentary community contend that the community was already conducting agriculture. Pretty self-explanatory, but still extremely debated. Just how many people would it take to make this place? Estimates normally range in the hundreds, and anticipate that the site would have needed some level of social stratification in order to organise the workforce and keep singular vision for the site in mind. As well as this, the fact that the site was constructed somewhat harmoniously, i.e. lots of the monuments go up at one time, does suggest that there were multiple construction teams, although dates for the construction of the enclosures and whether they were actually built at the same time or not is debated. As most academics believe the size limit of hunter-gatherer groups was about 120 people, this is how we get the theory that this was one big collaboration by multiple groups of hunter-gatherers. More controversially, those who contend that the site was a single community argue that the site could have been built with only a few dozen people. This theory is built primarily off an anthropogenic study on Easter Island, where some anthropologists were trying to recreate how many people it would have taken to move around the Moai. They were putting these statues on sleds and pulling them with about 180 people, only for the local indigenous people to come over and blow their minds by moving it with only 16 people, using a specific rope technique which would waddle the heads back and forth. This does supply good evidence for the ability of indigenous people to be able to move such monuments with only a few people, but most archaeologists still stick with estimates in the hundreds, as it is currently pretty much impossible to actually discern any building techniques. This is the idea that the site's cult was related to predator-prey relationships, and the general cycle of life and death. It is mostly taken from the site's iconography, which seems to depict a lot of potentially dangerous animals, including bulls, boars, foxes, spiders, scorpions, and lots of snakes. It has been noted that some of these depictions seem to suggest a kind of death blow moment. For instance, on this pillar, it seems like the animal has buckled knees and is dying, while a scary-looking something stares down menacingly at it, potentially about to have some dinner. We can take this idea further as well, with the prominence of hunted animals at the site, suggesting maybe this predator-prey focus had something to do with the hunting for their feasts. Lots of people think the first cave art was essentially a good luck charm or magic for future encounters with the depicted animals, and this idea could certainly apply to Gobekli Tepe. This is maybe the most common interpretation of the site's specific cultic practice, that it was somehow related to death and burial. In fact, when Schmidt first presented his findings at the site, he stated he fully expected to uncover burial remains in the future. Unfortunately, such a thing has not yet been found, although, as we know, only about 5 to 10% of the site has been excavated. The perceived predator-prey vibe is also commonly linked to this idea, and in terms of human death, there is somewhat of a theme of headless people throughout the site. Here on Pillar 43 is commonly seen as a headless person, and this sphere is also sometimes seen as a head. Schmidt found this fragment, nicknamed the Gift Bringer, which appears to be presenting a head, and those massive stone pillars do seem to be in the shape of a human, but they are headless. As well as this, in the bill of the level 3 enclosures, the fragments of at least 3 human skulls have been found. Additionally, it appears as if these skulls have been engraved upon, which was not an uncommon practice in the Neolithic Near East, and suggests some kind of post-mortem ritual, potentially in multiple stages of the body's decay. I've also seen the suggestion that the depiction of vultures at the site might indicate that this was one way in which the dead could have been disposed of. It sounds pretty wild, but it's actually not that uncommon. Going back to the site at Chateau-Hoyac, it seems part of their burial process involved getting vultures to strip the flesh off bodies, something vultures are so adept at, it won't actually mess up the anatomy of the skeleton once they're done. Ultimately, although the thesis remains popular, the lack of just stuff to support it means the hypothesis is fading a bit. There have been other bits of human bones discovered in the fill, and we will be bringing up this later, but it's really not much. This is an identification of the site's specific religious cult as one that worships its ancestors. This has been suggested in a variety of fashions, but it's most commonly sourced from those giant T-pillars in the middle of the enclosures that look like humans, as well as the aforementioned potential focus on death at the site. Not much can be really said with any more specificity about this theory. The basic idea is that people would go in there, chill out with these ancestor pillars, and you know how it is. Another related theory is put forward by Banning in his domesticity argument, where he contended the level 3 enclosures were houses. At a nearby site called Navale Kori, there is a similar structure to the level 3 enclosures with a T-pillar and all. As the site is a few hundred years older than Gobekli Tepe, Banning argues that this structure in Navale Kori was meant to represent the houses of their ancestors that once lived at Gobekli Tepe, and hence the site had become a place for ancestral worship over time. We pretty much spoke about this a little bit earlier, but it is worth a little bit more detail. Graham Hancock and others have proposed an ancient society existed before the last ice age. In these interpretations, Gobekli Tepe is seen as a place in which knowledge was transferred over from that society to survivors of the Ice Age, specifically information about religion, construction, and agriculture, stuff like that. To really dive into how valid this hypothesis is, it would take many, many videos, but I thought I would include it here in case you haven't heard of it. A big indicator of what Graham Hancock identifies as this civilization passing on knowledge is with what he refers to as handbags, seen here on Pillar 43. Similar iconography is found across the world, and Hancock sees this as members of that ancient civilization venturing around, teaching their knowledge and leaving this symbol. I think at one point he actually said that they were containers for psychedelics that civilization was spreading around. I don't want to go super deep into this here because, like I said, it's a very, very broad topic, but for our purposes today, that is pretty much what that theory sees Gobekli Tepe as. This one is pretty short and sweet. Multiple scholars have argued on the basis of architectural analysis and the likely fact that the structures were planned out as a collective, that all of the level 3 enclosures were actually used as one combined interlinked entity. It is worth noting, however, that there are about 20 more of the enclosures to be excavated, so for this theory to remain tenable, we'd be talking about one huge structure. This is a theory that kind of lurks in the footnotes of a lot of academic papers. Basically, there has been a lot of work put into tracking the distributions of animal depictions across the site, and this research has found that in specific enclosures, specific animals seem to be much more common than elsewhere. For instance, the snakes are dominant in enclosure A, foxes in enclosure B, boars in enclosure C, and birds in enclosure D. This has led to the interpretation that perhaps each enclosure was used by a separate hunter-gatherer band that identified their group through an animal. This theory certainly works with the hypothesis multiple disparate groups all came together at Gobekli Tepe for some purpose. I think this theory will be a lot easier to discern once we dig up some of the other enclosures. Whether or not the users of Gobekli Tepe were brewing beer in those huge vat thingies is not commonly addressed, but it will be of significant importance as the field develops. Alcohol has been interpreted into lots of social development theory, including the development of agriculture, and is increasingly seen as an indicator of social cohesion, no matter what a night out in Australia might otherwise suggest. Even more interestingly, archaeological evidence for beer is increasingly being identified as evidence for psychedelics. As to make beer, you need grain, and back in the day something called ergot could grow on grain, which if you made a potion with, will make you take a forced vacation to space. Psychedelics are not often interpreted at the site, and currently the only possible archaeological evidence for them is beer, but I think as the history of psychedelic use becomes much more popular, we're going to see this theory grow a lot. Archaeoastronomy is a growing field, but it does have a lot of problems. At Gobekli Tepe, there does seem to be some level of astronomical alignment, as many of the T-pillars are parallel with north-facing. Greater astronomical associations with the site, however, like a connection to the star of Sirius, Taurus, or Orion, are still highly debated, and hence haven't really got much traction in the academic field. This is completely my opinion, but I think a big problem is you can just plug all of these softwares like Stellaris into your computer and plug in the archaeological site and just draw a line to any star and say this is what they were on about. Unless we get some more contextual evidence from the site to support such a viewpoint, we are really just drawing lines from the site to random stars. That said, it's very likely that the people of Gobekli Tepe had much more of a connection to the night sky than we do, but exactly what kind of connection that was is almost impossible to say at this point. This refers to the fact that all of the iconography at the site, with one exception, is what we assume to be masculine or male. The exception is what is thought to have been a piece of graffiti and depicts a female body with what I think could be described as a T-pillar head. I live in fear of YouTube copyright, so I'm not actually going to put up pictures of the woman or the many, many meat cylinders, but they will come up straight away if you Google for them, and they are fairly explicit. What can be discerned from this gender disparity is argued in a variety of contexts. Part of Schmidt's original interpretation of the site as focused around death and burial was based off the fact that in traditional academics, the presence of female iconography is often associated with fertility cults. Why this is, I've never actually been able to discern, but Schmidt took this to the logical opposite with all the male iconography and interpreted it as signs of death, effectively anti-fertility. Other archaeologists have suggested that it represents an aspect of the site's cultic rituals, that perhaps only men were present or coordinated the ceremonies. That the site served as some kind of marriage ceremony location is also suggested, but this is pretty dicey territory. As for the female figure, I haven't actually seen any interpretations as to why it exists, but I like to imagine a bunch of Neolithic teenagers giggling to themselves as they engraved a lewd image on what is now one of the world's most mysterious and significant sites, but was probably just their dad's workplace. Now, this is actually a concept derived from the field of psychology, but such is the significance of Gobekli Tepe, it has even worked its way in there as well. The general idea is that on the road to developing writing as we know it today, humans first progressed through proto-writing, which was not thought to appear for thousands of years before the site's excavation. The fundamental advantage of writing is being able to store knowledge outside of your brain. And proto-writing is basically systems that accomplish this before linguistics were themselves transferred into writing. At Gobekli Tepe, this means stories, ideals, and practices that would have been stored in the site's iconography, and repeated phrases and sentences in the site's iconography have even been suggested, basically communicating something more complicated than what a single image could say. This might not sound super significant or crazy, but by golly, psychologically it's a pretty wild development, and hence the site is now relatively popular in the academics of psychology. The development is usually tied to growing social stratification. If you remember the 150 people thing, the theory is basically once your brain can't maintain relationships with your community, you need something else to communicate stories, ideals, religion, power, and culture beyond just chatting. You can't chat to 150 people with a meaningful relationship, and proto-writing was the developed way to do this. This is an interpretation I've only ever seen discussed once, but it's still very interesting. The idea was originally birthed out of the fact that in what we call the pre-pottery Neolithic, the time Gobekli Tepe was made, there is very, very little evidence for warfare, which is out of step with modern anthropological models, which suggest the growing social stratification of people meant there would have been battling aplenty. More recently, a site known as Tepe has been excavated, uncovering nearly 800 graves, and in those graves, only 4 of the 276 analysed have been hypothesized to have been a result of combat. As well as this, there are 4 forearm bones that have something called a parifracture, which is suggestive of some kind of dueling. Due to the lack of evidence for war in the greater pre-pottery Neolithic record, it is suggested that these people were killed as persecution from the greater community. Assumptions about this site are then carried over into Gobekli Tepe, and it is hypothesized that sites like Gobekli Tepe or Tepe created almost a kind of court scenario for the multiple hunter-gatherer bands that are thought to have made up its inhabitants. The fact a lot of iconography seems to be about the death blow or whatever does tentatively support this, and evidence for human sacrifice or execution is mainly based around the seeming theme of headless people around the site. Outside of iconographic evidence, the human bone fragments are the only real evidence. However, the fact that the enclosures were covered over has also been interpreted as a kind of sacrifice, especially of the T-pillars, which seem to represent a specific person. And this is a really good point, and regardless of specifics of human sacrifice, the covering up of the T-pillars undoubtedly would have been a significant occasion. The interpretation also works well with the idea that these enclosures were attributed to specific groups, so their covering up would have been a sacrifice or punishment maybe to one specific people. Especially significant to this interpretation is the idea that there would have been some kind of disciplinary board overseeing the politics of the pre-pottery Neolithic, which is a pretty fun concept. This theory proposes that the iconography around the site actually depicts constellations and a specific period related to the Younger Dryas. The idea was put forward by Sweatman, who thought that the site was a memorial to proposed comets that started and or ended the last ice age, which began 1500 years before the site was built and ended within centuries of the site's construction. Specifically, the iconography of Pillar 43 is lined up with constellations, and if we assume that the big circle is a sun moving through this specific period of the zodiac during an equinox, we get the following possible dates. The Younger Dryas was proposed to have been 10,900 BC, so this lines up fairly well, and Sweatman lines up the square things here to other preceding equinoxes. If you're like me, you probably don't understand what I just said, and that's probably a mixture of I have explained it terribly, and it is just a very convoluted theory. All you really need to know is that this iconography is linked with the beginning of the Younger Dryas, which is also linked to a common impact. The proposed use of Gobekli Tepe then is that the site was to memorialize the event, with the headless depictions around the site indicating a great tragedy. Needless to say, this theory is not very popular. Sweatman uses what I would say are some pretty shady tactics to support this theory, like this completely random and uncorrelated statistical equation he bangs in to make it seem like his hypothesis is more likely. That said, the site is super close to the Younger Dryas, so it does at the very least beg the question of what kind of relationship would have the builders of this site had to the time period? How would it be remembered in that culture? This was a hypothesis put forward by a German team in response to what they claimed was an over-focus on the religious aspects of Gobekli Tepe. The idea generally was that the site and iconography was used to record effectively scientific research that the builders of the site had carried out on local flora and fauna in a completely non-religious context. Now, because the work for this hypothesis is in German, this is pretty much as I can discern, and it's important to remember that what we are looking at today is only a fraction of the theories of Gobekli Tepe. The work out there in German alone probably surpasses that in English, as the excavation team was German. Along with my other sources, a link to the lab theory will be in the description if you read German, and if you do read German, let us know what you find out in the comments. I would be super interested for some more details, or just any other experiences you've had with multilingual history. As you might anticipate, this is just scratching the surface of what is going on around Gobekli Tepe right now, and hardly a grain of sand as to what I think it will be in future. It's a site I think we can all connect to at some level, and the immense amount of conflicting ideas presented here are evidence of that. If you've got your own ideas, leave them in the comments. I would really love to read them. I think every idea should be researched properly, so don't worry if it's a bit weird or something like that. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe if you enjoyed, and I hope this made your day a bit better.